I became a night shift nurse because I thought I could handle the chaos. Growing up, I always believed that helping others was a calling, not just a job. But let me tell you, working nights in the ER isn't about heroics, it's survival. The hospital after midnight is a different beast. The constant buzz of fluorescent lights, the beeping monitors, and the faint smell of antiseptic cling to you like a second skin. The rhythm of the place changes as the night deepens. The usual madness slows down, but the silence that replaces it isn't comforting. It's heavy, almost expectant, like something waiting to happen. And in the dim light, you start to notice things you'd never catch during the day. The team I work with feels the same. Most of them are drained, operating on caffeine and autopilot. Even the senior staff carry this unspoken understanding. Night shifts are where the weird stuff happens. One of the older doctors, Dr. Callahan, told me on my first night, at night, not everyone who walks in here needs medical attention. I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just his way of spooking the newbie. But he wasn't joking. Over time, I started noticing it too, patients that didn't seem quite normal. Things you couldn't write off as exhaustion or stress. And then, one night, it all started making sense in the worst way possible. It began with a man who came in complaining of severe chest pain. Nothing out of the ordinary there. ERs get heart attack scares all the time. But this guy was different. He kept his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, even as his face twisted in pain. When I asked him to take them out so I could check for swelling or discoloration, he hesitated, like he was afraid to show me. I insisted. It was protocol after all. When he finally pulled them out, I froze. His fingers were all wrong. They were reversed. The thumbs jetted out from where his pinkies should be, and the rest of his fingers curved inward like they had been reattached in the wrong places. He caught my expression and just smiled, his teeth jagged and uneven, like someone had crammed too many into his mouth. The room felt colder as I continued his assessment, my hands trembling against his skin. I asked a colleague to double-check the vitals, hoping someone else could confirm this wasn't some bizarre trick of my imagination. But when I turned to get her attention, he grabbed my wrist. "You shouldn't stare," he muttered, his voice low but clear, as if he knew exactly what I was thinking. I didn't even respond. I just moved through the motions of care as quickly as I could, documenting his symptoms and running tests. But here's the thing. When I went to pull up his record later, there was nothing there. No admission, no notes, no sign he had ever even been in the building. Not long after that, another case rattled me even more. A woman was wheeled in unconscious by paramedics after collapsing at a bus stop. She looked normal enough, middle-aged, a bit pale, but nothing alarming at first glance. However, when we hooked her up to the monitors, the readings didn't make any sense. Her heart rate would spike to impossible levels, and then flatline for a few seconds before stabilizing again. Her oxygen levels were fine one moment, then plummeting the next. "Faulty equipment," one of the paramedics muttered, but we swapped out the machines twice. The results stayed the same. When she finally regained consciousness, her eyes opened slowly, and for a moment, they didn't seem to focus. Then, out of nowhere, she locked eyes with me. Her gaze was sharp, piercing, like she wasn't just looking at me, she was looking through me. And then she spoke. I swear to God, I didn't understand a single word she said, but I felt it. Whatever she mumbled wasn't meant for my ears. It was like she was planting the words directly in my mind. My head buzzed with a pressure that wasn't quite pain, but close enough. Her lips stopped moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind, lingering in my head like an echo. A few nights later, I started noticing other strange patterns. Patients would show up, sometimes in terrible conditions, but their charts wouldn't match reality. One man came in with a deep gash across his chest, something that should have required immediate surgery. But the moment we prepped him, the wound was gone, leaving only a faint scar like it had healed decades ago. Another woman had no visible injuries, but screamed in agony as if her bones were breaking one by one. The x-rays came back clean. None of it made any sense. And when I went back to review their files, most of them weren't there. It was as if they'd been erased. The weirdest part was the staff's reaction, or lack thereof. No one seemed to care. When I asked a co-worker about a patient from the previous night, they'd shrug or act like I was remembering wrong. One time, I even brought it up to Dr. Callahan. He looked at me with this tired, knowing expression and said, "It's best not to get too curious about the night shift crowd." That phrase stuck with me. It wasn't just the patients that didn't belong. It was the atmosphere, the sense that the hospital itself was bending under some unseen weight. One night, I stayed late after my shift to catch up on paperwork. The ER was unusually quiet, with only the faint hum of machines and the occasional rustle of a janitor's mop down the hall. As I flipped through patient charts, I found one that made my stomach drop. It was a record for a patient I had never seen, a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old. The description was vague, but one detail stood out. Temperature, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. That wasn't a fever or hypothermia. That was room temperature. My skin crawled as I stared at the file. When I tried to pull it up digitally, the system crashed. I decided to take a break and clear my head. Passing by the corridor that led to the morgue, I stopped dead in my tracks. There were footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. I leaned in, thinking maybe it was security or someone from the pathology department. But when I called out, the footsteps stopped. The air felt heavy, like I'd walked into a freezer, and a faint smell of iron hung in the air. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild from exhaustion, and hurried back to the main floor. But the sense of being watched followed me, lingering at the edges of every shadow. Things escalated during one of the busiest nights I'd ever worked. Ambulances kept arriving back to back, each patient in worse condition than the last. But as I moved between beds, something felt off. One man had pupils so dilated his eyes looked completely black. He wouldn't respond to questions, just stared at the ceiling, murmuring a soundless rhythm. Then there was a woman who came in convulsing, but when we tried to restrain her, her strength was unnatural. She flung a fully grown orderly like he weighed nothing. Her body eventually went limp, but her eyes remained open, fixed on me, unblinking, even as we pronounced her. The final straw was the child. A woman rushed into the ER holding a boy who couldn't have been older than 6. He wasn't crying, but his pale face and sunken eyes made my chest tighten. I reached out to touch him, but my hand recoiled instinctively. His skin was ice cold, not the kind of cold you'd get from exposure, but a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. The woman begged me not to register him in the system, her voice frantic. "Please, don't put his name down," she whispered. Before I could press her for details, she bolted, leaving the boy behind without a word. As I stood there, frozen, the boy began to whisper something under his breath. It wasn't a language I recognized, if it was even a language at all. The sound was low and guttural, almost like a growl layered with words. The lights in the room flickered, and the monitors on the other patients started glitching, their readings jumping to impossible values, or just flatlining entirely. The air grew thick, heavy enough that each breath felt like a struggle. I called for help, but no one came. The nurse's station was just down the hall, yet the place felt utterly deserted. I grabbed the boy's wrist to check his pulse, but there was nothing. No heartbeat, no warmth, just that same icy chill spreading through my fingers. His head turned slowly to look at me, and his eyes, they weren't human. They shimmered, reflecting the overhead light like a predator's, and I swear I saw something moving behind them, like shadows swirling in water. Then he spoke directly to me. I don't know how to explain it, but I didn't hear the words with my ears. They were in my head, sharp and cutting, but incomprehensible. My knees buckled, and I stumbled back, every instinct screaming at me to run. I stumbled out of the room, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I tried to call for help again, but the words stuck in my throat like something was squeezing it shut. When I turned back, the boy was standing in the doorway, staring at me. He hadn't made a sound, but there he was, motionless, his small frame almost blending into the shadows. The flickering lights cast his face in and out of focus, making him look less like a child and more like something else entirely. I stepped backward, bumping into a crash cart, sending its contents clattering to the floor. Then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights steadied, the monitors resumed their steady beeping, and the air felt normal again. When I looked back at the doorway, the boy was gone. My heart pounded as I ran through the halls, looking for him. But it was like he had never been there. No one I asked had seen a child come in, let alone one matching his description. The bed where I had examined him was already stripped and cleaned, as if it had been empty all night. I didn't sleep after that shift. I couldn't. I sat in my car for an hour before driving home, replaying everything in my head. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. When I finally mustered the courage to check the records later that day, there was no mention of the boy, the woman who brought him in, or even the chaos in the ER. It was like the night had erased itself. I thought about bringing it up to Dr. Callahan again, but something stopped me. Deep down, I knew he'd just give me that same cryptic look and tell me to let it go. The next night, I was halfway through my shift when I found a note in my locker. It was written in handwriting I didn't recognize, on a plain piece of paper. All it said was, "You did the right thing." This time, my blood ran cold. I looked around the locker room, but it was empty. Whoever left it hadn't been careless. There were no cameras in that part of the hospital, no way to trace who'd been there. And yet, the words haunted me. What choice had I made? What did it even mean? After finding the note, my paranoia hit a new level. Every sound in the hospital felt sharper, more deliberate. The steady beep of machines, the soft shuffle of footsteps, even the murmur of voices from distant rooms. It all seemed like it carried a hidden meaning, something just out of reach. That night, I found myself avoiding certain hallways, especially the one leading to the morgue. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared, and the feeling of being watched had only gotten worse. The final incident happened near the end of my shift. A patient came in alone, walking upright but unnaturally stiff, like his joints didn't bend properly. His face was slack, expressionless, and his clothes were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if he'd been buried. As I approached, he turned his head toward me with a jerky motion and smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. His lips stretched too wide, showing teeth that were all the same size and shape, like a row of perfectly matched tiles. The man didn't say anything, just handed me a file folder. I took the folder with trembling hands, unsure whether I should even open it. My instincts screamed at me to leave it alone, but curiosity, or maybe dread, got the better of me. Inside were pages of medical records, but not ones I recognized. The names were strange, almost like they'd been scrambled or written in a language I didn't know. The vital signs listed on the charts were impossible. Blood pressures so low they should indicate death, temperatures colder than ice, and notes in the margins written in jagged, erratic handwriting that I couldn't make sense of. When I looked up, the man was gone. I hadn't heard him leave, hadn't seen him move, but the spot where he stood was empty. I checked the cameras later, desperate for proof that he'd been there. Nothing. Just me, standing alone, clutching a folder that didn't exist. By the time my shift ended, I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Even the regular patients seemed strange, their faces blurred in my memory, as if I couldn't tell who was human and who wasn't anymore. As I left the hospital that morning, I felt like I was walking out of another world. The rising sun should have brought relief, but instead, it felt like an illusion, a thin veil over whatever nightmare I'd been pulled into. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home, even though I was alone. Every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should, and the silence felt oppressive. I didn't even go straight to bed when I got home. I just sat there, staring at nothing, trying to convince myself it was all stress, lack of sleep, maybe even hallucinations. But here's the thing, I know what I saw. And even now, I can't stop thinking about that note. You did the right thing. This time. What happens next time? Do I see those patients again? What if I make the wrong choice? I still work nights at the hospital, though I dread every shift. The others don't seem to notice anything wrong, or if they do, they refuse to talk about it. As for me, I've learned to keep my head down, to not ask too many questions. Because whatever's happening in that ER, I'm not sure it's something I want answers to.